We're past the three-quarter pole, Professor. Slide 104.
I was going to say good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Slide 104 is a comment from Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings that has a lot of content to it. So I probably should say something or other. There is no, you can see why two economists working on something for 3 years, which involves interpreting the treaty and reading that there's no economically rational reading of the treaty. But stand up and take notice.
Might irk you?
Yeah. There is no economically rational reading of the treaty promise that would allow the Crown to claim deficits of billions of dollars for over 50 years and require the Anishinaabe to bear the burden of those deficits, because no rational counterparty or partner would agree to a relationship agreement that permitted such an outcome when the party was contributing to that relationship something of obviously enormous potential value. As the saying goes, there's a lot to unpack in that, but I'm only going to address a couple of elements to it.
Please do. Are we going over to 105 now?
Slide 105. Let me just remind the court that when the RST was signed, resource revenues were, I think everybody agrees, resource revenues were uncertain, and negative NCRRs could not be ruled out. Furthermore, the RST, as we read it, did not require that the Anishinaabe bear the burden of deficits. They would receive at least the minimum annuity set out in the RST. There was nothing in the RST that stated that if there were negative NCRRs, annuity payments would be negative. The approach we've taken is taken with that in mind. Our annuity approach, which we've termed, for better or for worse, the Vidal-Anderson approach, ensures that since volatile annual NCRRs are converted to a smooth stream of Vidal-Anderson annuities, which cannot fall below the amount guaranteed by the RST. So I'm explaining why our approach would ensure that the RST Anishinaabe would receive at least a minimum annuity and not negative ones. The Anishinaabe are not required to bear the burden of NCRR deficits. In our approach, with or without this discounting, it's the Crown that ends up bearing the burden of the negative NCRRs in recent years.
Now, are you on to slide 106 now?
Slide 106. To be more explicit, or if you prefer to be more repetitive, under our annuity approach, the Crown would bear the risk of volatile and possibly negative NCRRs. The RST beneficiary's annuity would never be less than $2,000 in total. Not a princely sum, but not negative. I've attached a figure on the next slide, which I'll turn to in a minute, which depicts the volatility of NCRRs relative to our annuities, our Vidal-Anderson annuities. The Vidal-Anderson annuities smooth out variations in the NCRRs and reflect the annuity augmentation the Crown would provide without incurring a loss. They also reflect the fact that the BTA rate would be used to calculate the annuity. If I may turn to figure on page 107. This funny looking figure has two graphs on it. One is the graph, the red graph is of risk adjusted NCRRs occurring annually. if I had put on this graph unadjusted NCRRs, either 100%, 50%, or 84%, there would have been an even more pronounced, I think, fluctuation in the red line. The point is that the red line varies a lot over time. When you feed this into the annuity machine, what comes out the other end are annuities depicted by the blue line. Bearing in mind that the annuity machine both smooths out payments to the RST Anishinaabe and ensures that they never fall below some minimum amount. So that is the limit of my response to the quote that I had earlier on. I think, I mean, I could comment on the last sentence about the land being of enormous potential value, but of course nobody knew that in 1850. So it wasn't necessarily irrational for the Anishinaabe to sign a treaty if they didn't know the value of the they didn't know, for example, that they didn't even think that the value of the land was worth an enormous amount. Next slide.
108.
108 is actually the last slide of this section, which is the second last section. And it's just simply a summary, just to refresh your memory, a quick summary of what we've talked about under this heading. The Stiglitz-Hutchings RST report preferred sharing awards 84% of net resource rents to the RST Anishinaabe. The Hutchings RST report also proposes an 84% share, but applies it to NCRRs rather than to net resource rents. Those are two very different things. Both of these are based on a so-called joint venture approach, also called a risk-sharing approach, in which the RST Anishinaabe share the risks and obtain volatile amounts, including negative entitlements in some years, or would obtain volatile amounts.
Could you just
negative entitlements in some years.
Just slow down a little bit if you could, please?
In contrast, we have proposed an annuity system. After all, the treaty, the RST, talks about annuities when it's talking about augmentation. So we took a long time running through our mind, what does it mean to make an annuity augmentation? What are annuities? And we came to our annuity model using what we think of as a common interpretation of annuity, which is a return on an asset. We propose an annuity system whereby the Crown assumes most of the risk. The RST and Anishinaabe are guaranteed positive annuities based on the BTA rate of interest. And the share is based either on a percentage of unadjusted NCRRs or 100% of risk-adjusted NCRRs, which we've indicated to be our preferred approach as economists. So that summarizes this section on sharing.
Can I just ask a question here? I'm just going back to this comments about what people knew or didn't know, expect or didn't expect in 1850. And I do not have an exact memory of the report on the treaty negotiations, but I have a pretty fair recollection of it. And I'm presuming that you read, with the treaty, you read possibly the report of Robinson. So my understanding is that certainly when Robinson arrived for the treaty negotiations. He had a capital sum. I don't know if he had it in cash or in the letter. This is the amount of money he had to spend. And if that is right, nobody was thinking too much about any future or any risk or any obligation. They, as best I could tell, the Crown was thinking about a transaction that involved a cession of the territory, consideration for an amount of money. And that amount of money, and the money was in two parts, a sum paid at the time and a sum that was promised as an annuity. But the entire consideration, as I understand it, and I'm happy to be corrected, was capitalized. And I believe I understand that that was the practice with other treaties. So if it was capitalized, and if, as it appears, the augmentation clause was a rather last-minute idea of Robinson, so it hadn't been discussed at the Executive Council, he didn't come with particular instructions on how to assess risk. Why do we think risk is such a big feature of this treaty? Isn't it, if the cession was financed by a capitalized amount, presumably the Crown thought they're for sure that they didn't think they were undertaking any risk. And Robinson, knowing that, then explained as best he could that he wasn't imposing a risk on the Crown. So why all of a sudden is risk such a huge part of understanding the Crown's conduct or expectations, or this focus on uncertainty? Why that? Where's that, sort of asked this before, where is that grounded in what was going on in 1850?
I'm not a historian, of course, but I've read, no doubt, not as much as you have on this. I've read various documents and accounts of the events leading up to the treaty. I've read the Vidal-Anderson report, for example, which makes specific reference to the idea that the Anishinaabe had no idea what the value of the territory was.
Right. No, there's no quarrel with that assertion, I believe.
And I also
sorry, except for the notion that it had value, but how much was not known.
Not the way I read the Vidal-Anderson, but I assume you're right. They must have thought it had some value. Yeah.
Oh, they being the
Anishinaabe.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking, we're talking about the RST here, of course, not the RHT, but the RST.
Okay.
And I don't want to say things that I can't substantiate because I'm not an historian, but it's true that in instructions, Robinson was given a fixed amount of money to work with, partly driven by the budget constraint of the government, no doubt. Partly driven by, what had been done in other treaties, probably. Who knows? I mean, it's hard to say. It's hard to say how
we heard a great deal of evidence about budget constraints.
Okay. Some of that was paid out as a lump sum, and some of it was paid out as an annuity. The uncertainty arises partly from the fact that people didn't know what the territory was worth, but it also arises because of the fact that there was this augmentation promise included in the treaty, which was unique, as far as I understand it, to this treaty.
Right.
And the augmentation promise necessarily reflected some uncertainty, because the augmentation would not have been paid had there been no, it was contingent on, let's put it this way, it was contingent on resource wealth being discovered, resource revenues being obtained from the treaty territory, which allowed augmentation to be paid without the Crown incurring a loss. So the uncertainty, in my mind, arises because of the augmentation clause, not because of the initial $2,000 annuity put into the treaty. So I come along as an economist, and I look at this thing, and I'm asked, well, I'm not sure I was asked this, but part of my task is to say, well, how do we deal with the fact that there is some suggestion that this augmentation promise has not been fulfilled, that augmentation went up to $4 a head and hasn't changed since, despite the fact that there might have been some revenues generated from the territory. And I said to myself, well, how are we going to evaluate this promise without taking into consideration the fact that the future NTRRs in the territory were not known? They were highly uncertain. The ability of the Crown to pay augmentation was not known. And so that's where the uncertainty arises. Now, we incorporate an uncertainty in the way we approach this through our use of risk adjustment. I understand that's not something that everybody's comfortable with, but to an economist, this is to most economists, I would say this is a sensible way to go. But even if we didn't use risk adjustment and didn't deal with uncertainty explicitly by using the tools that we have in economics to deal with uncertainty, we can still calculate a share of NCRRs and convert them into annuities using the procedure that we're talking about, and make it contingent on certain things. Make it contingent on the fact that the annuity cannot fall below a base amount. Make it contingent on the fact that the Crown is not supposed to, the Crown is not instructed, I'm using the wrong word, but you understand what I mean? They're not, annuities are not intended to be augmented if doing so would cause the Crown to take a loss. So, our annuity approach takes all those things in consideration. Whether you do that in a context of accounting for uncertainty or not is a matter of economic taste. And our view as economists is that you cannot ignore the uncertainty associated with either the NCRRs or the net resource revenues. You shouldn't ignore it, let's put it that way. Because if you ignore it, you're left proposing a scheme which imposes on the RST Anishinaabeg a highly uncertain, highly volatile stream of payments, which is what the risk-sharing joint venture approach does. So it's for somebody else to judge whether what we're doing is the right thing or not. But our approach takes into consideration all of these things. It attempts to design an annuity scheme, which is what the RST says it should be. Augmentation should be in annuities. It attempts to do it in such a way as to not impose the burden of risk on the RST and Anishinaabeg. In other words, to have the Crown take on the risk of potential volatility rather than the Anishinaabeg. So I guess I've got to repeating myself now.
I've got it. Okay, thank you.
All right, let's move to section 7, wealth deprivation. And you begin on slide 110 by setting this section up by grounding it in the Court of Appeal decision, as I understand what you're going to say.
Okay, let me approach this by first acknowledging that this is not an easy concept. That the instructions that were given, but they're not instructions, I shouldn't say that. That's not the right word to use, but how we're informed to deal with this is based on comments in the Court of Appeal decision, which are not 100% transparent to an economist, let me put it that way. So we've interpreted it in such and such a way, and I'll go through how we've interpreted and contrast that with the way in which Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchinson interpret it. So just by way of background, I'll put up a quote from the Court of Appeal decision, which you will be familiar with. Just for context, the Court of Appeal decision says that to fulfill its augmentation promise, the Crown, first, is required to periodically engage in a process in consultation with the First Nation treaty parties to determine the amount of net Crown resource-based revenues. Okay, so that's the first thing, is determine how much we're talking about. And secondly, the Crown, if there are sufficient Crown resource-based revenues, to permit the Crown to pay an increased annuity amount without incurring a loss, is required to pay any such increase. So that's just something we're already familiar with, just for context. And further, in the reasons for judgment, reasons for decision, based on the trial judge's reasoning, the common intention of the parties was to share in such a way that would provide for both communities. This would suggest that the quote share, I'm not sure if I put that quote in or if it's in the original document, but in any case, it's emphasized. This would suggest that the share promised is to be determined not only based on the extent of Crown revenues, but also with reference to the relative wealth and needs of different communities. Rightly or wrongly, we've interpreted that to say that relative wealth, or relative wealth and needs, if you like, informs the share of NCRRs going to RST and Anishinaabeg, not the total amount to be shared. I mean, it's kind of a fine distinction, but I think in this context, it's actually quite important. That our interpretation of what the Court of Appeal is saying is that what's at stake here is the determination of the share of the NCRRs that should go to the RST and Anishinaabeg, not the total amount to be shared. The total amount to be shared is not the wealth difference. It's the NCRRs. So that's the setting.
Just if we could just hold there for a second, please.
When you use the word the share, can we put the size of the pie? Is that what you're saying?
The share is the division of the
piece
pie.
of the pie.
Yeah.
So you're saying, or sorry, when you say what's at stake here is the determination of the share of the NCRRs. So that's the share of the pie being defined as the NCRRs. It should go to the RC.
Yes.
And not the total amount to be shared.
Yes, that's my interpretation.
The total amount to be shared is the pie.
That's right, Ron. So you can think of this, the share of NCRRs as being, we're going to choose between 100% of NCRRs unadjusted, 84% of NCRRs, 50% of NCRRs, 100% of it.
Right. But so you say what's at stake here? What we can look at, you're saying the Court of Appeal is saying what you can look at for correcting any wealth disparity is the share, is best looked at the sharing stage?
That's my interpretation of what the Court of Appeal is saying, is that the wealth differential, if you like, should be taken into consideration in determining how the pie is shared, not the size of the pie to be shared.
Not how to determine the size of the pie.
Yes. Because that's already been agreed to. It's already been agreed elsewhere in the stage one and Court of Appeal decisions that the pie is determined by the NCRR.
Okay, thank you.
Slide 111, please. The RST reply report from Stiglitz and Hutchings.
So I'm going to spend a couple of slides here explaining what we do before I turn to what Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings do. First of all, I'll note that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings state that Boadway and Smart do not offer an affirmative view on how to calculate the difference in relative wealth. That's in their RST reply report, paragraph 3. And first of all, I would say that that's not the case, that we do in fact estimate wealth differences as instructed. We don't estimate income differences the way that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings do, or Mr. Hutchings himself does, but we estimate wealth differences as instructed. But we measure wealth differences of the existing cohort of people alive. We don't measure wealth differences historically going back to previous generations. That is to say, we estimate wealth differences between existing RST beneficiaries and off-reserve Ontarians. Existing is a key word there.
Off-reserve, I believe so. Sorry. Very on.
So just to be sure about the difference between wealth, which is what we're measuring the wealth per capita of RST Anishinaabe, currently living ones, and off-reserve Ontarians. Wealth is the value of assets held net of their debt set against those assets. And so it can include financial assets, bonds and stocks, which are what we've been talking about for the last couple of days, but also could include real property, including housing. We've done different calculations with and without real property included in the calculation. But the point is that wealth is the stock of the value of some assets. Income, on the other hand, is something completely different. Income is the annual amount of earnings from work, plus income from the ownership of assets like interest, dividends, capital gains, and so forth, plus any transfers that individuals receive from the government. So that's what income is. Just to be sure of that difference, because I'll come back to it when I contrast what we're doing.
Can we just stop for a second, please? Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so that I'm just making that distinction between income and wealth because it's a difference between the approach taken by Mr. Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz compared to the approach that we take. So, and again, our focus is on existing RST Anishinaabe members and off-reserve Ontarians, rather than the history of all of the members of the Anishinaabe back to the time of the treaty, which is another important distinction in approach that we take. And not to say that existing RST beneficiaries wouldn't benefit from compensation paid for shortfalls of past augmentations. Our proposal is to look at what would happen if we gave the current RST beneficiaries all of the sum of whatever we interpreted to be the shortfall in the augmentation promise. We gave that all to the current Anishinaabe. What would that do to their wealth relative to the wealth of non-reserve, off-reserve Ontarians? All right, so then turning to, once I'm ready to turn whenever.
All right, let's do that. 112.
So let me very briefly go through our approach to wealth disparities. The first premise is that compensation should be larger to the extent that wealth of the RST Anishinaabe is lower than that of non-Indigenous Ontarians. So if we're thinking about using these wealth measures to influence the share of NCRRs going to the RST Anishinaabe, one principle we would bear in mind, in accordance with the Court of Appeal prescription, is that compensation, the share should be larger to the extent that the relative wealth of the Anishinaabe is lower.
Does larger mean larger than 50-50?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. A higher percentage, whatever that, yes.
Or just higher than lower?
Higher than lower, yeah.
Okay. And when you use non-Indigenous Ontarians, is that the same as off-reserve Ontarians from the previous slide?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should be careful here. We rely on data from Statistics Canada, and the wealth data that we use do not identify non-Indigenous Ontarians. What they identify in their wealth measures is off-reserve Ontarians. So our presumption is that off-reserve Ontarians are preponderantly non-Indigenous Ontarians, or at least non-RST Indigenous Ontarians.
Right, but the group of non-Indigenous Ontarians, if you're using the StatsCan data that only measures reserves, certainly could include Indigenous Ontarians.
Yes.
And in fact, could include RST Indigenous
Indeed,
Ontarians.
indeed, yes.
Okay, so is that better said in that bullet, off-reserve Ontarians?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
So the second, if I may continue.
Yes.
The second bullet simply refers to what you had anticipated, which is that the wealth and differences inform the sharing of NCRRs, but compensation cannot entail the Crown incurring a loss. So it cannot exceed 100% of either unadjusted or risk-adjusted NCRRs. So we're when we use the term sharing, we do it in a constrained sense that the sharing cannot be such that it causes the Crown to incur a loss. So what we do is we compare the wealth of a typical Ontario household, off-reserve Ontario household, to the maximum amount of compensation to the average RST and Anishinaabe household. And we look at what would happen if we took all of the amount owing through the present value of whatever annuities we had. We gave them to all of the existing households, RST annuitants, and we compared that amount that we gave. We assumed, just to make, I hate to use this word, but just to be conservative, I tried to avoid using that word. But in any case, we're assuming here, for the sake of argument, that the RST annuitants, that their initial wealth is zero, just to make our case as strong as possible. And we're going to compare what their wealth would be if we gave them all the compensation that was owing now. And we compared that with the wealth per capita of the typical off-reserve Ontarian. And what we're going to find is that what that comparison would yield would depend upon what share of the NCRs we were going to give out, and whether or not we included housing and so on.
And can I just ask one question on that? You compare the wealth of a typical Ontario household to the average RST household, including a maximum amount of compensation.
We're going to interpret the wealth that the average RST household would have if they receive their equal per capita share of the compensation of the,
under which model?
Well, it'll depend on which model we use, but I'm going to give a couple of examples of that.
Well, you conclude some disparities would remain with any of the models?
Some disparities would remain with our risk-adjusted model, for example.
Okay.
Yep, I'll show you that on the table.
Okay.
You have a final point on this slide?
Well, the final point simply makes the observation that if per capita compensation, when I say per capita compensation, I'm talking about dividing up what is owed to satisfy the augmentation promise according to us versus according to, say, Mr. Hutchings. Mm-hmm. If we base that if we divided up the augmentation promise according to Mr. Hutchins' NCR estimates, and we gave those amounts per capita to the RST Anishinaabeg, since the size of the Hutchins RST NCR estimates are much higher than ours, they would lead to much higher financial wealth of the RST and Anishinaabeg relative to the typical Ontario household. That's neither, I'm not making a judgment about that. I'm just saying there's going to be a difference depending on what amount of compensation we assume is going to be paid through this to meet the augmentation promise. But to repeat, what we're doing is we're taking different versions of satisfying the augmentation promise, and we're assuming that that bundle of money is going to be given as a lump sum divided up among the households of the RST Anishinaabeg to determine what wealth they would have if they got that money. And we're going to compare that with the wealth that the average non-reserve Ontario household has.
But aren't you jumping a step? Didn't you say that the whole idea of taking wealth disparity into account was to determine what the share would be? And I thought I just asked you in bullet 3, what approach are we using here? You say any of them. And is that the same with, is that the same with the 4th bullet point?
What I'm trying to establish here is what would happen to the relative wealth of the RST annuitants versus households, RST annuitant households versus the off-reserve Ontario households. What would happen to their relative wealth if we paid out all of the annuity promise compensation on an equal per capita basis to these people? I haven't said anything about what the next step is. And the next step is to say, well,
I thought the first step was figure out what the wealth disparity is.
That's what I'm doing.
Then figure out what the share is.
That's exactly, and I'm doing the first step here.
So without figuring out what the share is, you say that there's some amount that if you paid that out on a per capita basis, it would result in a certain disparity or non-disparity.
Yes. But to be honest, Your Honor, we're not going to answer the second question. All we're doing is providing information about wealth disparities so that they can be used to determine what the share should be. For example, you could use them to determine what the share should be. We're not, it's not our competence to say what the sharing should be. We're just sort of saying how, what the wealth differences are so that you can take into consideration those wealth differences when you're determining what the share of the NCRRs should be.
Okay.
That's right. Which is in general the same approach that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins did. The details are different. Okay.
Okay. I think we're going to slide 113.
On slide 113 and next couple of slides, we just go through the detailed calculations. And we have to first of all know, we know what the total compensation is going to be under various schemes. We know what the present value of NCRRs is going to be under an annuity scheme or a non-annuity scheme, different sharing percentages, et cetera. All we're going to do is take whatever scheme we're using and divide it equally among RST annuitant households. So what we have to know is how many of those are there? How many RST annuitant households are there in existence in 2016, which is the year for which we're doing this calculation, because that's the year for which we have data on RST households. So the procedure is to take the number of RST annuitants, and we're going to base the number of RST annuitants on the pay list provided by Canada. There are other ways of doing this, and some may object to it, but that's what we're doing. These are the people that actually claimed annuities. We're going to take the pay list data provided by Canada. We know that annuitants receive $4 per capita. We're going to calculate the total number of annuitants based on that pay list data. Then we know, according to the 2016 Census of Canada, that the average size of RST households was 2.6. That's the number of people in the average household. So obviously no individual household is going to have 2.6 people in it, but that's the average size of it. And what we get as a result is that there were in 2016, by our estimate, 2,323 RST annuitant households. Of course, that might not be the same as the number of members of the RST itself, because some annuitants, some people might not have claimed their annuities, or whatever. So I understand that there may be some problem. So that's the number of annuitant households. So now we're going to take, we're going to calculate the amount of compensation that would be paid to each household by dividing the total value of the present value of NCRRs or annuities, as the case may be, by the number of households. So if we turn, if we're okay there, we turn to the next slide.
Slide 114.
And I'm just giving you the bottom line results here, assuming that we know roughly what we've done. If the compensation per RST annuitant household is based on the present value of Vidal Anderson annuities that we've calculated, then if we put risk-adjusted NCRRs into our annuity machine, the amount that would be attributable to the RST and Schnabek would be $84.8 million. I don't know whether you remember that from before. But if we take that $84.8 million as the total amount that would be owing, divided by the number of households, that would amount to $36,505 per household. On the other hand, if we used 100% of unadjusted NCRRs, again put through the annuity sausage machine, under the annuity scheme, 100% of unadjusted NCRRs would be worth $697 million in present value terms, after having deducted the annuities that have already been paid. So if we use those, the amount that would be paid per annuitant household would be $300,000. So that's a bit of a difference. There's, depending upon which sharing rule we decide for the annuities, the amount that would be paid per household would differ.
So that's 697.1 million. That's the 999 number we saw earlier, plus the 302.
Exactly.
Or minus the 302.
Minus the 302. Yeah, exactly right. If we were to base the compensation on the present value of Mr. Hutchings' RST and CRRs, the ones he reports in his report, according to his report, the compensation owing, which is based on 84% of his estimate of the present value of NCRRs, would be $56.9 billion, which if you divide it by 23, the number of households, would represent $24.5 million per household. So that those are alternative versions of the amount that annuitant households would get from different versions of the present value of annuities owing. And what we're going to do,
I'm sorry, just one thing on the second bullet. You'd have to adjust that 56.9, would you, for some amounts paid, or what I recall a 46. Am I mistaken? Do I recall a 46 or $44 billion number earlier when you were doing 80, when you're doing 100%, or am I wrong?
You're saying that we should adjust the Hutchings RST and CRRs by the annuities that have already been paid. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Do you have to do that in the 56?
Yes, you do. I'm not sure if I've done that or not, but it's probably not too. I mean, it'll be consequential, but it's still going to be the case that the amount that would be provided would be a substantial amount, several millions of dollars.
Okay.
So we're going to assume then that
we're being, I'm sorry, you're just being asked to slow down a little bit, if you could.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
We're going to compare these numbers. We're going to compare the size of these payments that would be made out of the present value of annuities or NCRRs. We're going to compare those with the net financial wealth or the gross or the net wealth of a median Ontario household. So I put one figure in here, and I'll show you in the next table where that figure comes from. The figure I put down here is the net financial wealth of the median Ontario household. And that is 173,400. So two things about that statement. What is net financial wealth and what is the median Ontario household? The net financial wealth is the financial wealth of households net their debts, but not including their real property, not including their housing, in other words. So that's one comparison we're going to make is what if we compare these payments, these financial payments to the annuitants with the financial wealth of the median Ontario household. What do I mean by the median Ontario household? I mean the households for whom 50% of the households have more wealth and 50% of the households have less wealth. The median is different than the mean. The median is different than the average. Okay. So according to this calculation, the present value of risk-adjusted NCRRs, which will give only $36.5 thousand per household to the Anishinaabe, is insufficient to equalize household wealth levels, because assuming that the Anishinaabe had no wealth to begin with, they would only have $36,000 of wealth after they got these present value of these annuities. But that wouldn't be enough to bring them up to the wealth of the median Ontario household. But if instead we used the 100% of unadjusted NCRRs and gave them each $300 per household, that would be more than enough. 300,000, 300,086 is the amount per household that the annuitants would get if we based the payment on the present value of annuities arising from 100% of unadjusted NCRRs. That's a bit of a mouthful. So the point is that whether the payment of these annuities to existing households is more or less than would be required to equalize household wealth depends on which of the schemes we're talking about, which of the sharing schemes we're talking about. Okay. Well, the next slide, I think, simply depicts this on the same information and a little bit more, but the same information on a table, actually. So it just summarizes the fact that the hypothetical compensation payments per annuitant household, we've reported three different values. One, when the annuities are based on risk-adjusted NCRRs. One, when the annuities are based on unadjusted NCRRs.
But 100% of them.
100% of them, yes.
So no sharing model under 100%.
Yeah, 100, that's right. 100% is 100% of the share of unadjusted.
Yeah. And so 50% would be 150K.
I hate to complicate things, but not exactly, because the annuity machine doesn't allow you to do that. But roughly speaking, you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, that summarizes the information I just showed in the previous slide. So perhaps
before we move on that, move forward from there, just based on the comment you made on slide 114 about the second bullet here, the compensation, 56.9 billion turns into 24.494 million. And you indicated you'd have to do some math to break that down for amounts paid, I think you said.
Yes.
And is that the math you already did on slide 83? Let's just call up 83 just briefly. I'm just going to ask you if that's so. Written book number 1 there. Is that the?
Well, actually, what you just said is correct. That the $46.4 million already has annuities paid taken out of it.
Right.
So it's the final figure. Yeah.
Right. And so on slide 114, if you netted out the 56.9 billion in the second bullet, is that the number you get? Is the 46?
It should be. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then to your table you're on now.
Well, sorry. I think you're right, assuming that I take 84% of those.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're right.
And then if you do the same thing to the 24 million on slide 115, you're going to get 20.1 million or something like that after making that adjustment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just trying to keep all of math connected, the thread of the math connected.
I missed what you said, Mr. Marcello, for modification to slide 115.
I think the 24.49 translates roughly into 20.57.
Mr. Marcello was claiming correctly that the number I reported there for the Hutchings RST report, NCRRs, has not applied the 84% rule, and it's not deducted the annuities already paid. So it's not the correct number. The correct number is closer to 20 million, as Mr. Marcello said.
The other numbers you've already shown the math on. So, okay, so let's go forward then.
So this is just a comparison, or kind of bottom line comparison between what would happen to the relative wealth of RST, Anishinaabe annuitants relative to off reserve Ontario households in 2019, using the number of households of 2016, I should say. But in any case, what I've shown here is that if we use what I'm reporting here is the financial wealth of Ontario households against which to compare the numbers in the previous slide. So if we measure the financial wealth of off-reserve Ontario households to include housing, then that their average wealth would be $855,000. But we would prefer to make the comparison with the median wealth of off-reserve Ontario households, because the mean is driven up by the fact that a very small number of very highly wealthy people are bringing up the average. Mm-hmm. So the median, it seems to us to be a more accurate representation of what families in the middle get. So nonetheless, without housing, taking into consideration, it's 440,000 is what the median household would get in Ontario in 2019. If we exclude housing, that would go down quite a bit to 173,000, reflecting the fact that housing is a very large component of the wealth of Ontario households. I think we all know that. You can debate whether or not housing should be or should not be included. People who make calculations of wealth distribution often exclude housing because it has different costs in different communities. So it's hard to compare a person who lives in a house in an urban area of Ontario, say a suburb of Toronto, with the person who lives in a rural area. The very same house would be worth a lot less. And so including housing includes, in some sense, biases the thing, because it gives a lot of weight to the fact that you have to pay a lot of money just to live in a high income urban region in Ontario. But that being as it may, I mean, these are just ballpark comparisons in any case. Okay, so we're comparing these financial wealth of the Ontario households with the amount that would be paid to the RST Anishinaabe households. And I'm not sure what the next slide says, but I should look.
117.
Okay, I wasn't going to say any more about that, except to say that depending upon how the augmentation promise is calculated, what present value of annuities you use, you may or may not bring the RST Anishinaabe up to the median wealth of the Ontario household. So for example, if you based annuities on 100% of unadjusted NCRRs, or probably on the basis of 84% of unadjusted NCRRs, the wealth that the average RST Anishinaabe household would get would be more than enough to make them equal to the median wealth of offered reserve Ontarians. That's sort of
sorry, that was 84% of Hutchings NCRRs? Whose NCRRs?
Of our unadjusted NCRRs.
Yours.
No, Hutchings NCRRs are more than sufficient to bring the RST Anishinaabe up to the wealth of the average Ontario household.
Okay, so your statement was if the annuities are based on 84% of your NCRRs, then
I haven't put this calculation here, but I'm conjecturing that if instead of 100% of unadjusted NCRRs on page 115, we had said, well, let's suppose we base annuities on 84% of unadjusted NCRRs. My conjecture is we would still have enough money to give the RST Anishinaabe enough money to make their household wealth comparable to the net worth of the median Ontarian, not including housing. Sorry, that's a mouthful.
It would bring it up to the median wealth of Ontario, excluding housing. So it would bring it up to $173,000.
Yeah.
Or you say bring it easily up.
At least up to that. Yeah.
Well, the math would be 84% of 300, so you're north of 240. Right?
Well, as I was just saying, you can't do that kind of a percentage because these annuities are put through a machine.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you know, these are kind of ballpark comparisons, and it's just the kind of information that we're putting out is to say these might influence your decision about what share of NCRRs should go to the RST Anishinaabe and which shouldn't. Let me, however, turn to what Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings did just to finish off.
Was this slide 117 now?
Slide 117. Now, I just want to begin with a statement that is found in Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' reply report. Presumably it's in their earlier report as well. And I can see I took this from our first version of our report. In any case, to be responsive to the Court of Appeal, this is the instruction that counsel has given to Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. To be responsive to the Court of Appeal, what is the difference in the relative wealth of the Robinson, I say Huron, I mean Robertson Superior Treaty beneficiaries and descendants of foreign settlers? So the council instructions that were given to Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, and which appear in their RST report, state, to be responsive to the Court of Appeal. What is the difference in the relative wealth of the Robinson Superior Treaty beneficiaries and descendants of foreign settlers? That was the instruction. That was the only instruction that was given about dealing with this clause about the relative wealth and needs. And my first comment to that is that, well, that's actually what we did. That wasn't an instruction to us, obviously, but that in fact is what we tried to do. We tried to compare the relative wealth of Robinson Superior Treaty beneficiaries with that of the descendants of foreign settlers, by which we mean non-reserve, which we measure as non-reserve Ontarians currently alive in 2019. And so we would interpret what we did as being exactly what's being requested here of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. Of course, the person who wrote that instruction might not agree with my interpretation of it, but that's the way I interpret it. What Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings do is they do not measure the difference in relative wealth of the Robinson Superior Treaty beneficiaries and the descendants of foreign settlers. What they do instead is they estimate the aggregate of all past income gaps between the RST, Anishinaabe, and the non-Indigenous, their proxy for the non-Indigenous Ontarians. In answer to this question, they estimate what we call income gaps, or what they call income gaps, which are not the same thing as estimating relative wealth. So that's my first comment.
Slide 118, please.
Yep. I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but just as a quick run over of what Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings did in approaching this instruction that they received. First of all, they used per capita total income as an indicator of wealth and needs. And they sort of said it in some places that total income was, they were using it as a proxy of wealth to get at wealth disparities. They define an annual income gap as the difference in the per capita income of RST members versus non-Indigenous Ontarians times the number of RST members in each year. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a very simple concept. If you take the year 1900, they look at the year 1900, they look at the average income of an RST member in 1900. They compare that with the average income of a non-Indigenous Ontarian in 1900. Whatever that difference is, they multiply that by the number of RST members in that year, and that's their definition of the income gap. You can think of it as being, sorry, I'm going too fast here. You can think of the income gap as being the amount of money that would have to be paid to the RST members to bring their average income up to that of the average non-Indigenous Ontarian. That's the meaning of the income gap. It's common to what economists refer to as the poverty gap. It's the same sort of concept. It's how much money would you have to give them such that their average income was comparable to that of the non-Indigenous Ontarians. So they do this every year between 1872 and 2019. And they convert these annual income gaps to a 2019 present value using their rate for compounding forward. So they're using their portfolio rate 60-40% to compound forward all of these income gaps to a 2019 present value. And they estimate those income gaps, those compounded income gaps, to be between $153 billion and $194 billion. Now, we've already talked about why there's that difference. And the difference arises because of the fact that they use these two different versions of population from Professor Bignami's report. If I I'm pronouncing it right.
I think so.
Okay, the so-called high growth and low growth population. Okay, so that's their response to their instructions. They measure these annual income gaps. And for comparison, you could compare these numbers, 153 billion, 194 billion. You could compare these with the estimate in Mr. Hutchings' RST report of the present value of NCRRs in the RST territories of $56.9 billion. So roughly speaking, the annual income gaps are 3 times, on average, about 3 times higher than the present value of NCRRs in the treaty territories, according to Mr. Hutchings' estimates.
Your Honor, I think there's 15 or 20 minutes to go. Should we take the afternoon break now?
Take some guidance. Yes, please. So we'll take the break. I'll be staying back.
Recess for 15 minutes. Well, I was assuming you may be seated.
I think you were about to move to, or had moved to slide 119, Professor?
Yes, that's right. All right, just to finish up this wealth disparity analysis, I have relatively few slides left. We just talked about the income gap measures that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings had estimated for the RST territory. What do we make of these things? What do we do with them? Neither Professor Stiglitz or Mr. Hutchings draw any implications from these income gap measures for the share of NCRRs that should accrue to the RST beneficiaries, which I take to be the intention of the relative wealth statement in the Court of Appeal judgment decision. Both of the income gap measures and the value of the RST territory, net resource revenues, estimated by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings as net resource revenues, exceed the value of NCRRs to be shared. So compensation to the RST Anishinaabe could not be based on 84% of either net resource revenues or the income gap without the Crown incurring a loss in the sense of having to pay more than the value of NCRRs obtained from the RST territory.
Could I just ask, when you say in bullet 2, and the value of the RST territory as net resource revenues, is do I take it to mean that the words value of the RST territory are what you say are their net resource revenues?
Yes, I'm afraid that's badly worded. That's exactly what I mean. That the Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings present 2 measures. One is the value of net resource revenues,
right,
and the other is the income gap measures. And Mr. Hutchings, at least in his report, interprets the income gap measures as being a measure of sharing, of what should be shared. I would say the pie rather than the sharing. In any case, I'm left a little bit up in the air as to what conclusions to draw from these income gap measures. They don't really respond to the instructions that were provided, and they're presented as sort of a fait accompli without indicating what we're to make of them. What we should use them for.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to slide 120. You identify here some things you consider to be problems with Mr. Hutchings' approach to wealth disparities.
this is a sort of winding up my comments on the Stiglitz-Hutchings and Hutchings approach to measuring wealth disparities through income gap measures. And I have two main comments. I think I guess I have more than two main comments. First comment is that total income, personal total income, is not a good proxy for wealth. So there's no sense in which measuring income disparities is equivalent to measuring wealth disparities. No doubt there's a relationship between total personal income and wealth, but personal income is not a good proxy for wealth. Among other things, personal income is a flow concept. It's something that comes in every year, whereas wealth is a stock concept. It's something that you hold as a stock, and you can carry it forward from year to year if you choose. Personal income, as I had indicated before, includes a variety of elements. The three main elements are earnings that you get from your work or from your business, capital income you get from owning assets such as interest, dividends, capital gains, rentals, and so on, and government transfers. That's personal income. What I'm calling labor income, earnings from work and transfers, are unrelated to wealth, directly at least. Certainly, the wealth that you can accumulate might be positively related to the labor income that you earn, but there's no direct correlation. And so in that sense, personal income is not proportional to wealth. And so I would say it's not a very good proxy for wealth if the objective of the instructions was to measure wealth disparities. The choice of income measures a lot of things, as the report indicates, but it doesn't measure, it's not a good proxy of wealth. If I were to look to use some concept of income, the proxy for wealth, I would focus on income from wealth. If I looked at all of the income that wealth generates in the form of capital income, interest, dividends, capital gains, these things are all proportional to the wealth, to the assets from which they're generated. So as an economist, and this would be what an economist would say, is that if we want to use a concept of income to proxy for wealth, we would be better to use something that's directly related to wealth, like capital income, rather than including earnings and government transfers. So that's just a methodological comment that measuring the income gap is not really addressing the instructions to measure the wealth differential. And the second issue I would raise is that even if we were to measure annual proxies of wealth, if we were to measure wealth disparities annually, which would be comparable to measuring these income gap measures annually, if we were to measure wealth disparities annually, that would be misleading, because a high proportion of the wealth that you hold is carried on from year to year. So if you measure wealth in 1 year, and then the next year you measure wealth again, you're measuring the same thing twice. So measuring wealth disparities by doing it on an annual basis can cause what we refer to as double counting, counting the same wealth more than once. So this isn't to say that, I should say that the request to measure income wealth disparities is not an easy request to fulfill, partly because of statistical problems, but partly because of conceptual problems. But what it does mean is that it I think makes more sense to do it the way we did it, which is to measure wealth disparities of the current cohort of people alive, rather than to try and measure the sum of wealth disparities that occurred historically, at least for the purposes of trying to evaluate how wealth disparities should affect the payment of compensation. And in fact, I would interpret the instructions that were given to Mr. Stiglitz, Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings as saying precisely that. But the instructions to me read like as if we want to measure wealth disparities of current population of Indigenous people, annuitants relative to the current population of non-Indigenous residents.
Slide 121.
Slide 121. Just to repeat something that I said already, I see that I do repeat myself sometimes. The income gap provides little guidance about the shares of NCRRs that should go to current generations. Just a little elaboration on that. I'm interpreting the wealth disparities prescription by the Court of Appeal as saying something about wealth disparities of current generations of determining the shares. Most of the income gap, if you look at in detail at the income gap measures that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings have supplied, most of the income gap reflects income levels of RST beneficiaries who are no longer alive. That is to say, over half of the income gap occurs in the years 1870 to 1950. And less than half of the total income gap occurs after 1950 and includes many RST members who have since passed away. And as I have also already said, the income gaps far exceed the present value of NCRRs or the present value of risk-adjusted NCRRs. The difference in the income gap could not be eliminated through annuities without causing the Crown to incur a loss, which would be incompatible with the terms of the RST augmentation clause.
And when you make your comment at the second bullet on slide 121, you're saying the income gaps as measured by Stiglitz and Hutchings.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Slide 122, wealth and needs disparities in perspective.
Okay, now I only have 2 slides to go, and I don't want to leave the impression that economists are really mean people, although it might come across that way. So I want to sort of put this issue of wealth and these disparities in some perspective, if I may. And I'll begin by saying that it's entirely appropriate for the Crown to address persistent gaps in income and well-being of First Nation peoples. Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings document very nicely the kinds of gaps in well-being that exist: education, health, besides income, and so on. And it's entirely appropriate for the Crown to address that. Sharing in Crown NCRRs can certainly contribute to that objective, but it's not the only policy instrument for that purpose, and it's not, I would say, a particularly effective one. It's a risky source of revenue, which is typically dispersed as cash transfers, possibly to the First Nations themselves rather than to individuals. But it's only one element of what should be a broader social approach to addressing disparities in wealth and needs. And one can well understand why the Court of Appeal would say wealth and needs disparities are critically important and should be addressed. But I'm just suggesting that we have to think of this in a broader context and not rely on the augmentation clause to be the policy instrument for settling differences in wealth and needs among communities. There are other policies implemented by both the Ontario government and the Canadian government, governments of the Crown, that are potentially more suitable for addressing these wealth and these disparities, such as addressing the deficiencies that exist in public and social services, health outcomes, housing, and so on. Things which exist quite apart from the issue of the RST annuities. So if I may go to the final slide.
123.
I would just put the head of this side, the role of the Crown in a broader sense. One of the broader obligations of the Canadian and Ontario governments is to tend to the needs of all First Nations peoples, including the RST beneficiaries. Indeed, to all peoples, I guess one should say. And to do this, a broad array of policy instruments is used over and above treaty annuities, including health, education, community infrastructure, protection of persons, property, and so on. There's obviously a lot of work to be done, but one promising indication I found in looking through Mr. Hutchings' RST work papers is by looking at one of the tables, table 33C, and inferring from that table that per capita incomes among RST members were less than 50% of those Ontario-wide from 1870 to 1898. They're at first part of, still in the first part of the post-treaty era, 48%. That actually fell to 16% at the end of the First World War, 1918. So in 1918, per capita RST incomes were only 16% of those Ontario-wide. But since then, they have gradually risen to about 60%. So I view that as being a positive trend. Differences in other dimensions of well-being persist, such as health and education status. And I think we're all aware of these differences. I just think that we shouldn't, I just want to put into perspective that addressing the annuity deficiency in the RST is it in and of itself not sufficient to address the wealth and these disparities among communities. And that is the end of what I have to say.
Do you have anything else, Ron?
No, thank you.
Professor, I'd like to thank you very much. I would like to ask you to remain in your chair for a while. I gather this will not extend beyond 4:30 today. Some other lawyers here may have some questions for you now by way of cross-examination. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Professor Boadway.
Yep.
My name is Harley Schachter. I am a lawyer for a number of the plaintiffs, the First Nation plaintiffs. I have a couple of questions for you, and imagine we're going to go over until tomorrow. But I wanted to start with asking you a question about something that you told the judge yesterday. The judge had asked you whether you had watched the court proceedings. You remember her asking you that?
Yes.
And you remember what your answer was?
I don't.
Well, the record indicates that you had told the judge that you didn't watch the RST proceedings. Might that have been a mistake?
That was definitely a mistake.
Right. You did watch it. You were online, right?
Not the entirety, but I watched this a portion of it.
So you watched last week's testimony of Mr. Smart?
Most of it.
Okay. And you were online watching other people testify previously, correct?
I was.
And you had an opportunity to read Dr. von Gernitz's report?
I didn't read his report.
You did not at all?
I read parts of it before, but not after he testified.
Oh, okay. I apologize. So
I didn't hear his testimony, I should say.
No, that's okay. But you, in preparing your report, you had an occasion to read Dr. Von Gernit's report.
I did.
And did you have
parts of it?
I'm sorry?
Parts of it.
Parts of it. And how did you know which parts to read?
I looked in, well, that's a good question. I don't remember. I probably looked in the index.
And maybe you had a conversation with Dr. Von Gernit.
I never spoke with Dr. Von Gernit.
No? Did you communicate with Mr. Smart about what parts of Dr. Von Gernit's report to look at?
I don't recall doing so.
And did you have an occasion to review Dr. Eric Angel's report?
I read what I think was an earlier version of this report.
And did that earlier version help inform your opinion about what happened in the 1850s in respect of investments?
It did.
Thank you. And
with respect to the BTA accounts.
Okay. How about in respect of what people understood in 1850 about where First Nations money was going?
It depends what you mean by First Nations money. Do you mean annuities or do you mean money that they had themselves?
Proceeds of sale.
Yes.
That was, so you had some discussion with Mr. Angel about that?
Yes, he wrote about that.
He wrote about it. Now, how does the report that you relied on differ from the report that's before the court? Can you tell us?
I didn't read the report that's before the court.
Okay, well, do you have the report that you did rely on from Dr. Mr. Angel, yeah. Professor Angel, yeah.
I probably have it on my, I'm sure I have it on my computer.
Well, with my friend's indulgence and perhaps with the court's guidance, perhaps we can ask you to take a look at the differences between the two reports, if there are differences, and report back to us tomorrow. Would that be something that you'd be able to do?
I could, assuming I could get a hold of his report for this trial.
Yeah, go ahead.
There is an appendix I think it's in all three of the main Boadway and Smart reports. There's an appendix on Van Trust accounts and how they were asked to assume they work for purposes of their reports. So I don't know if more than that is necessary. It does lay the foundation for everything to say about that Van Trust accounts. I think it's appendix B.
I'm not sure how that connects with the questions, but
well, I don't know what.
I'll tell you my concern is this economics expert has read a report that might be different than the report before the court that Mr. Angel is going to, I take it, testify to. And to the extent that there's differences in those reports, I think the court should know, and I certainly want to know if there are differences. Now, maybe there's not, but it behooves us to ask the question. So I'm not saying there's anything nefarious going on. I just want to make sure that everyone's using the same data, because if you, sir, and you would agree with me, I hope, that if you relied on facts or information that is different than what is the court's relying on, it might affect your opinion. You understand? You agree? Mm-hmm. Yes. You have to say yes. Okay, thank you. So with that, I wonder if my friend is prepared to reconsider his what I consider to be a he hasn't really said whether he would do it or not, instead saying that perhaps there's no need. I think there is a need.
All right. So the question is just of Ontario, will they supply a copy of the report as filed?
Yeah. The request is for the professor to take a look at it and advise if there's any difference between it and what
well, maybe an easier way of dealing with this is is Ontario claiming any kind of privilege in respect of the first draft report? Because if you're not, then maybe I can do it myself.
We are. I mean, we are asserting privilege over any draft reports, but I don't. I think maybe some dialogue between my friends is probably the first thing to do here.
Before you claim privilege, do you want to take a look at those reports to see if there is any meaningful difference?
I must say, I'm not sure the complexity of this case. I'm not sure precisely what it is we're talking about. It actually is a report, whether it's a conversation.
Well, no, I thought I heard Professor Boadway say he read a report.
I heard him say that too.
That it is not a report filed.
So I'm happy to assert privilege now. I want to find out what this report is. I'll take it from there.
All right.
I mean, well, my concern is we don't have a lot of time. We have until tomorrow morning, and I'm not sure how we can deal with it other than whether I guess I was trying to avoid having to have a privilege argue a privilege motion by seeing if it really matters at all, right? I mean,
well, let's say this, Mr. Marcello, you're tasked tonight with determining whether you have any reason to assert privilege or you want to, and communicating with Mr. Schachter by 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we'll see where that goes.
Okay. I want to just run down what it is that's being talked about. Thank you.
Now, I understand that you did not review Dr. Dribbin's report in preparation of your report.
Which report?
Dr. Paul Dribbin.
What was the name of the report?
You don't remember Dr. Dribbin?
I do.
Okay, so he only had one report involving ethnohistory.
Yes, I looked at it. I looked at that report.
Oh, okay. So
I read that report actually.
Pardon?
I read that report. If it's the same one that that appeared in the court.
I noticed that your reports don't mention his report or his comments or opinions at all. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right.
And do you know why you didn't comment on it at all?
I read a lot of reports that I didn't comment, and I read them for background understanding. I read actually a lot of not just historical reports, but also reports that were prepared for this. And I didn't feel I needed to, there was no occasion in which I thought it was relevant to what I was saying. Okay.
How about Professor Bignami's report? Did you read her report?
On demography?
Yes.
I did.
And I note that, would you agree with me that nowhere in your reports is her report mentioned?
I think that's right.
And
I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
That's my understanding, but you don't recall it being mentioned at all?
Well, I was certainly aware of the use of the report for talking about high and low population growth estimates in the Professor Stiglitz, Mr. Hutchings report. Whether I actually referred to that report in giving my understanding of these high and low population estimates, I'm not sure. But I definitely read that report, and I knew what was meant by high and low population estimates.
Professor Boadway, one of the things that sort of struck me is that Professor Bignami had certain population numbers, and I'm just estimating, but the population numbers that she used came from before she estimated a larger cohort, came from Canada. Did you use information from Canada as well?
In our calculations on wealth disparities, we use pay lists.
Okay, why didn't you use the actual population of beneficiary members?
It was a judgment call. We were using estimates based on we were using estimates based on people who had actually been paid annuities.
But why is that relevant if the cohort that's entitled to annuities includes all band members? Why did you only choose a portion of band members?
It was a matter of judgment. We could have chosen another database as well.
Was it because if you used the figures you use, which is 2,023 families times 2.6 people per family, you get a little under 7,000 people?
That wasn't what motivated us, no.
Would you agree with me that that is about accurate math, that you do end up with a little under 7,000 people?
23 times 2.6, whatever that is.
Right. So we can all do the math. I'm going to suggest to you that it's a little bit under 7,000 people.
Okay.
And would you agree with me that the cohort, according to Canada's documents, is at least 13,000 people?
I don't know that for sure. I can check it.
But using 7,000 people instead of 13,000 people almost halves the result. Would you agree with that?
If that's what we did, yes.
And so again, you say you don't know why you did that, or what was the judgment call in doing that? Why?
Nothing nefarious was going on. We were just trying to find a ballpark estimate, if I can use that term, for the implications of different present value annuity or NCRR schemes for per household wealth. And we chose to measure households based on pay lists. We could have chosen to use them based on some other source, but we chose them we chose to measure them based on pay lists. And that's the end of the story. We could have done something else, but I don't.
But there was no reason why you didn't use population?
No reason why we didn't use population.
I just find it
not a nefarious reason. We chose to use what we thought was readily available to us, and which estimated the number of people who had actually received annuities. I appreciate where you're going with this, and it would have been different had we used a different population estimate for sure.
Did you review any reports from phase one in preparation?
Stage one you're talking about?
Stage one, phase one.
Okay. I don't remember. I don't remember what the reports were from stage one.
Dr. Von Gernert had a number of reports from phase one. Is it possible you read those reports?
It's possible I read part of them, but I don't remember. I read a lot of things. There might have been other reports on. I don't remember.
But you can't remember, and is it possible then that you didn't read any reports, or you just don't remember, or seems like something that if you did remember, wouldn't you put it in your report that you refer to it?
Well, the convention of referring things to things in our report is if we actually use them for our purposes. And if I had read parts of Professor Von Gernert's report, which I may well have, and I decided that it wasn't something that I was going to draw upon for our analysis, then we wouldn't report it. We were parsimonious. We referred to things in our report that we actually used in our report. Now, obviously, we were informed in some intellectual sense by the things we read.
Yes.
But if we didn't quote from them or draw directly from them or use the arguments directly from them, we didn't report them as sources that we used.
Right. I want to turn to your treatment of what you call a joint venture approach, and I want to make sure I understand terminology. Am I correct that you equate a joint venture approach with a risk sharing approach?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that?
Sorry, may I just rephrase that?
Yes.
I think Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings called it a shared risk approach, not a risk sharing approach, but I may be wrong.
And you equate a shared risk approach with a joint venture approach. Is that correct?
I use the terms interchangeably because Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings use them interchangeably.
And is that different than a revenue sharing model?
A revenue sharing model, if you interpret the revenues as being NCRRs or net resource revenues as the case may be, I suppose that's the way they interpret it. Yes, they treat their shared risk model as if the RST and Anishinaabe got a given share, i.e. 84% of either net resource revenues or NCRRs, yes.
All right. And how about you? Do you equate a joint venture approach with a revenue sharing approach?
I don't have a strong view on that because a joint venture can mean a large number of things. And I don't think a joint venture necessarily means a revenue sharing approach.
Okay, I wanted to get into that and ask you a couple questions about that. And perhaps let's just use a hypothetical. I understand you experts are used to dealing with hypotheticals, so I'm going to give you one, okay?
Probably not as used to it as you are from my understanding.
Why would you understand anything? I've
listened to your questioning before.
Okay. Let's suppose that I happen to be a very wealthy man.
Mm-hmm.
And
hypothetical.
This is a hypothetical. Because what I own in my hypothetical is 13 million square miles of land. Let's suppose I come to you and I say, look, I think I can make some money with this land, but I really don't have the know-how how to do it. So let's have a joint venture where I give you the land, and our bargain is that if you can make money from utilizing that 13 million square miles, you'll give me a share. That's it. That's the crux of our bargain. But it's a little even better. If you lose money, you don't have to pay me anything.
Mm-hmm.
Now, under those circumstances, under that hypothetical,
mm-hmm.
I'm taking a lot of risk that you're going to perform, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what risk are you taking in that?
According to the way you explained it, it depends on how much money I put into the venture. But if I didn't put any in, I'm not taking much of a risk.
Okay. And so we should look to, in that example, we should look to see how much you put in to get a sense as to what kind of risk you're taking.
Not just that, the terms of the sharing. You know, if you say to me that, well, if you say to me, I'm going to get a 30% share of the gains, but I'm not going to bear any of the losses, that would be a possibility under a joint venture, I would presume.
Yeah.
But that's not the possibility that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings proposed.
All right, let's let them speak for themselves. I'm going to stick with my hypothetical, okay? So in the hypothetical I gave you, we haven't yet identified what shares each of us are going to get. It might be a share that turns out to be fair. It might be a share that I just trust that you as a good-hearted person will share with me.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't yet identified the share. Now, you might say in my hypothetical, well, but Mr. Schachter, how are we going to raise the money to build anything, to build a factory on the land, or to earn money from the land, or to build a mine? And if I were to say to you, look, that's your problem. You go and figure out, as part of our bargain, you figure out how that's going to be financed. If you have to go and get financing, you do it. But here's the upside for you. Whatever it costs you, whatever reasonable expenses are, you can take those off the top because we're talking about sharing only profits. We're not sharing the expenses, right? Now the expenses come off, so we are in effect sharing them. But now, does that mitigate your risk of having to raise the money to put in capital?
I'm having a little bit of difficulty following the stages of your argument here. Could you just?
It's not an argument, it's a question.
I'm sorry. I have a tendency to use the term argument because that's what we do in economics. But I'm having trouble understanding what you're proposing to me.
Okay, what I'm proposing is that in our joint venture, in our hypothetical joint venture that I've postulated, you're responsible for building the mine.
Yes.
And maybe you want to enter into another partnership or arrangement with a Falconbridge Mining Company and let them do all the work, and you just sit back and get some portion of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you said by that you meant yes. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in that hypothetical, you might say to me, you have to incur some expenses. And if I were to say to you, well, that's okay. You can deduct all those expenses before you have to account to me for anything. So that part of a bargain would mitigate your risk of the expenses, right?
Because I can deduct them from the profits. Yes.
Right. I mean, you might have risk vis-a-vis putting in money, but vis-a-vis our bargain, I've relieved you of any, you don't have to pay me anything unless there's net profits. So I've relieved you of risk.
Question?
Yes. Is that correct?
Is that a question?
Yes.
If I'm obliged to put some money up in order to support this operation, and I turn out to get zero profits, then I've borne the cost of whatever I put up. I'm not getting reimbursed for it.
Right.
So I'm bearing a loss.
All right. Now, suppose I was to go a little bit further and say, you know what? You incurred a loss there. Just put it in the tally. And I still won't ask you to share any profits until all those negative amounts turn out to be positive. Now, I am sharing in that risk, am I not?
Only if it's possible for you to have a negative outcome. Right. I mean, if the profits can't support the costs that I put in, and you're going to share the cost of the expenses I put in, you're going to get a negative outcome.
So let's use a number, use numbers to try and deal with this. Suppose you go to Falconbridge and say to them, you're going to get into an arrangement with them to build the mine, and you have to spend $20, and that's your expense. And the mine doesn't work out, and no one can pay you any money. Falconbridge doesn't pay any money, and you're out $20. Mm-hmm. Now, if I were to say to you, not to worry, let's just keep a running account. So instead of you owing me zero, you in effect now owe me negative. You don't owe me anything. I don't have to pay you the $20 right now, right? Or a share of the $20, but you don't have to pay me anything. And I don't get a penny until you earn $21 next year.
Okay.
So I'm bearing the risk of that $20, not you. Would you agree with that? You're bearing the risk of the cash flow is a way to put it. You're cash flowing the loss. I'm bearing the loss. Is that fair?
What's happening to the profit of the firm that I'm hiring? What happens to the profit of Falconbridge?
They get to keep it because it doesn't come to you.
So I don't get any revenues. I don't impose a tax on them and get. I'm not the government. In other words,
you were gonna okay. Let's say we'll change this paradigm. Falconbridge paid a $5 mining fee or a mining tax or what? No, there's only mining tax on profit. So they pay some sort of fee to the government. So the government incurs $20. You get $5. There's a loss of $15. And we just keep it on the books. What the government's incurred, I hope you agree, is the financing cost of that $15. But since you don't have to pay me until there's the $16, or sorry, until you make back at least $16 and are in a positive, it's actually me that's bearing the risk of that expense. Would you agree?
if I understand what you're saying, yes, but I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Well, what didn't you understand about it? Because I want you to understand what I'm saying because it's important.
I'm sorry, I can't reconstruct your hypothetical example because there's so many steps in it, and
okay,
you know, it's not very easy to follow. Okay,
perhaps we can leave it for tomorrow morning. Then I see it's 4:30, and we'll continue on.
Yes.
No, I've got a fair bit.
Oh. I guess.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to end for today, and then you have a matter?
Just a question. We can talk about this on or off the record. But
all right, so we'll end for today. Thank you. Convene tomorrow.